In this lesson, we're going to have a look at one of many different examples that are found throughout the world when we're looking at genetic mutation and genetic diseases. And the example that we'll look at today in great detail is sickle cell anemia. So before we dive into the specifics of sickle cell anemia, it's important that we kind of define what a genetic disease is. So we know that bodies have different alleles or different variants of certain traits, and some of these alleles we know can be harmful to the functioning of the human body. Now, certain alleles, in the case of recessive alleles, can be inherited from parents, and they're only going to be inherited when two parents both contain a recessive copy of this particular allele. And these are what are known as lethal recessives. This is going to result in an individual dying before the age of reproduction generally. However, this is in the instance of an individual inheriting two recessive alleles. The parents of these individuals often will be heterozygous for this particular trait, and they will carry that recessive trait. And in some rare instances, like in the case of sickle cell anemia, this can provide them with an advantage. As an individual who is heterozygous is going to end up with a higher fitness or a selective advantage compared to individuals, say, who are homozygous for the dominant allele. So, before we can talk about sickle cell anemia, we really need to understand what it's going to protect people against in the case of a heterozygous advantage, and that disease is malaria. So, malaria is spread thanks to mosquitoes, which transmit the malaria parasite. And now this generally occurs in areas with tropical rainforests, as we need quiet stagnant water, so quiet water that isn't moving or anything like that. And this allows for the breeding of that particular parasite. Now, as humans over a long period of time cleared out forests within Africa for agriculture, they changed the environment, and that led to increase of the breeding of that particular malaria mosquito, and which has led to an increase in malaria. Now, as we can see in the diagram here, the infected mosquito is going to bite someone who becomes infected. This disease, malaria, is going to infect their liver and target their red blood cells. And so then the red blood cells are picked up by another mosquito, and that mosquito will then carry the malaria and spread it to another person again. So, sickle cell anemia. How did it arise? Well, this is a simple substitutional point mutation in a gene that codes for hemoglobin, and what it results in is a distortion of the red blood cell. And the red blood cell, instead of forming a biconcave disc, forms a sickle cell shape. Now, effectively, the action of this, while it changes its shape, most importantly, it reduces the ability of red blood cells to carry oxygen. So some of the symptoms that people generally exhibit with the sickle cell trait are that all of their red blood cells will be sickle cell in the case of this sickling here. And this sickling is going to reduce their oxygen carrying capacity. As a consequence, it is lethal with shortness of breath, fatigue, and other infections resulting from a lack of oxygen transport around the body. And unfortunately, individuals usually die before they reach reproductive age. The key idea here is before they can reproduce. So it is not great to be homozygous for the sickle cell trait itself. People without the sickle cell trait, so those individuals with two normal hemoglobin alleles, generally, however, are at an increased risk of malaria in areas where malaria is very prevalent. And here's the interesting part. Individuals who carry the sickle cell trait, but also have the allele for normal hemoglobin, will generally have 20 to 40% of their red blood cells as sickle-shaped. Now, the reasoning here is that while we've spoken about lethal recessives earlier, this trait here is codominant. And as a consequence of that codominance, there is the expression of both regular hemoglobin and sickle-shaped hemoglobin. Now, this is going to provide some difficulty for individuals who are heterozygous for regular hemoglobin and sickle-celled hemoglobin, as they'll have difficulty or shortness of breath, especially when exercising at higher altitudes. However, it does confer a survival advantage in areas prone to malaria. So, it's autosomal codominant, as we've mentioned, and that sickle cell allele is passed on from parents themselves. So let's look at sickle cell anemia and malaria now. So the sickle cell trait, specifically in the case of heterozygotes, are resistant to malaria. So this heterozygous advantage is our key idea here. So if I change this point to red here to really hone in on it, a heterozygous advantage is expressed in this particular instance as the sickle cell allele is advantageous when individuals live in malaria-prone areas. So an individual who's heterozygous for sickle cell anemia is not going to have a survival advantage in an area without malaria. We're kind of dependent on this notion that these individuals live within an area that is prone to malaria. And as you can see on the diagram of the left-hand side, we have large portions of Africa, and we're also talking about places like India and Southeast Asia. Now, people who are heterozygous for this trait within these regions are more likely to survive malaria, they're going to reproduce at a greater rate, and they're going to pass on their favourable allele, aka their copy of the sickle cell allele, to their offspring. As a consequence of natural selection, this is going to eventually increase the frequency of the sickle cell allele in these malaria-prone regions.